Hi, everyone. Welcome back for the last installment of Midrash on the Parashah with Rabbi Dr. Sam Lebens. You know the drill by now, so I'll be promoting people to panelist. Please show your face. We'd love to see you, but no pressure to say anything. But if you'd like to, you're welcome to raise your hand or put questions in the chat. But please stay muted when you're not speaking. I think that's about it. Dr. Lebens, over to you.
All right. So for the last few weeks, and I'm sorry I wasn't here last week, but for the last few weeks, we've been sketching the life of Yaakov, of Jacob, through the eyes of Midrash. And I did manage to say 2 weeks ago that there's a sense in which last week in Parashat Hashavuah, Yaakov reached the height of his powers, the height of his ethical growth in this kind of final confrontation with Esau. I spoke about the idea that in Parashat Vayetze, Jacob sees this ladder and all the things that the Midrash says that this ladder represents, and yet he didn't climb it. And yet at the very beginning of Parashat Vayishlach, Jacob is commanding angels to take messages for him. And I spoke of his ethical maturity in terms of his ability now to get his hands dirty in the realia of real life, the nitty gritty of real life, which was something that his inherent purity made it hard for him to do. But what I didn't discuss was how quickly Yaakov fades into the background once the confrontation with Esau is finished. This comes immediately, really. In last week's Parashah, we have this terrible event with Dinah being raped and taken captive, and then Yaakov's sons taking a lead in securing her return, but doing it in the most horrific of ways. And there's this slaughter and subterfuge. Interesting that subterfuge is happening again in the life of Yaakov, because the children of Yaakov lie to the residents of Shechem and say that they will all circumcise themselves, they'll make a pact. But in fact, Yaakov's sons were just using this circumcision to weaken them and then slaughter them as a way of, I suppose, redressing what they thought, they thought was a just redressal of this injustice that had happened to their sister Dinah. But Jacob is not best pleased with this slaughter that was done in his name. And yet, throughout the actual negotiations with Shechem and Hamor, Yaakov is strangely silent. He takes a back seat. Now, in this week's reading, Parashat Vayeshev, Yaakov also just remains in the background. Primarily, this week is the beginning of the story of Yosef, his dreams, his conflict with his brothers. We have the story of Yehuda, Joseph's brother, and Tamar. And we have the story of Yosef's new life in Mitzrayim, which ends with Yosef's incarceration in Egypt. It's a result of his having been snared by the wife of Potiphar. And throughout these stories, right, Yaakov has all but retired. We know he's alive, although that's Yosef's repeated question in Parashat Vayigash. Is my father still alive? Yes, he's still alive, but he's there in the background. Now, the Midrash that we're going to look at today, it focuses on this fact, on the fact that Yaakov isn't all that present. He isn't all that active in this week's reading. And what the Midrash does is it teases out from that absence a central lesson, perhaps of the whole book of Sefer Bereshit, and certainly of Yaakov's life. Before we get to that Midrash, I want to take us through a detour. And that's what we've got on the handout, a quote from Soloveitchik, a quote from Franz Rosenzweig. I think we've had cause to mention in the past. I can't remember if it was with Jennifer or one of the other participants, but that the Hebrew Bible has two words for the verb of dwelling in a place, living in a place. The first is lashevet, which we wouldn't really use in modern Hebrew, although we do talk about the yeshuv as a settlement, a place that's dwelt in. Lashevet normally in modern Hebrew just means to sit down. And the second, which we more regularly use in conversational Hebrew for dwelling in a place, is lagur. But both are used in biblical Hebrew. The first, as I said, it shares its Hebrew root with the word for sitting, yeshiva. And I suppose when that verb is in place, the image is of dwelling securely, right? To dwell in a place, it's to reside there, it's to rest your weight in a given location, it's to sit down, it's to rest your weary legs. Whereas the second root, and this I think is much more interesting, the second root, the root of lagur, is the Hebrew word for a stranger. And that, I think, is counterintuitive, right? To be a stranger seems to be at odds with being at home in a place. In English translations that I've seen of this, they tend to use the English to dwell in place of lashavet and to sojourn in place of lagur. But I would never use sojourn or sojourn. I would never use that in conversational English. Perhaps the idea that the translators are trying to communicate is that sojourning carries some sort of nuance of transience. To dwell is to make a place one's home, whereas to sojourn perhaps suggests that you'll just be staying there for a while before journeying on. I wonder if sojourn and journey, they probably have some etymological link. Anyway, when Yaakov arrives in Israel at the beginning of last week's Parashah, he sends a message to Esau. And the wording of the message is Im Lavan Garti, I lived in Lavan's house. Now, Rashi, famously on that verse, he quotes a Midrash, and the Midrash plays with the numerical value of the word Garti, right? The numerical value of Garti, I lived, I sojourned, is 613. Talk about the Tariag mitzvot, so it's the same letters, Taf, Resh, Gimel, Yud, it just in a different order. Garti, I dwelt in a place, 613. Of course, the number famously corresponds to the number of commandments in the Torah as traditionally counted. But we know that word actually means I sojourned. The appeal here to numerology, I think, is okay, it's cute, but it implies that Yaakov managed to live in accordance with God's commandments, even in the house of Lavan. Okay. Im Lavan, when I was with Lavan, Garti, I kept the 613 mitzvahs. But this numerology, it's underwritten by the actual meaning of the word Garti. Yaakov is saying, this is the pshat, it's not some gematria midrash. He's saying he lived in Lavan's house, but he managed to remain a stranger. To sojourn in a place is never to feel quite at home there. So yeah, this fanciful midrash that Rashi quotes him, Lavan Garti, when I was with Lavan, I kept all 630 mitzvahs. It's not just cute gematria. It's paying attention to the meaning of the word Garti. I remained somehow a stranger, even whilst I sojourned in the house of Lavan. But if we sojourn in exile, you'd imagine that we should dwell in the land of Israel, but not so fast. Abraham and Yitzchak's relationship with the land of Israel, so we're talking before Yaakov, it's often described in terms of sojourning rather than in terms of dwelling. Not always, but often. For example, in last week's reading, when Yaakov was finally reunited with his father, this is Genesis, it's written here, 53:27. It says that Yaakov came to Yitzchak, his father, in Mamre, that's Kiryat Arba, which is Hebron, where Yitzchak and Abraham sojourned. It uses the word from lagur, right? So if this is the promised land, if this is the homeland, then surely you'd have expected them to dwell in it rather than just sojourn in it. But they didn't. Indeed, famously in Hebron, Abraham described himself to his neighbors. This is in Parashat Hashavuah when he wants to buy a funeral plot. He describes himself to his neighbors in terms of both of our verbs. He said to Bnei Chet, the children of Chet, he said, Ger v'toshav anochi, Ger v'toshav anochi imachen. I am a resident alien in your midst. That's Genesis 24, verse 4. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who I quote now in this this source in the Rav Speaks, or the which is the Chamesh Drashot. These are a collection of 5 drashot, 5 homilies that Rav Soloveitchik delivered when he was the president of the World Mizrahi organization, the kind of religious Zionist organization. In one of those speeches, he famously has this description of Abraham's status as a ger toshav. What does it mean to be a resident and an alien? A resident alien reminds me when I was a postdoc in America. My daughter was in kindergarten and my son was in 1st grade, and we came to see some concert that kindergarten had put on, and there was this song. I think it was for President's Day, and it was "I'm proud to be an American," something like that. And my daughter was singing that, and my son, who was in 1st grade and was watching, he said, "You're not an American. You're a legal alien." She was a resident alien. Anyway, here's the quote. Abraham, this is on the source sheet for those of you who want to follow along. Abraham's definition of his dual status as a resident alien, we believe, describes with profound accuracy the historical position of the Jew who resides in a predominantly non-Jewish society. He was a resident, like other inhabitants of Canaan, sharing with them a concern for the welfare of society, digging wells and contributing to the progress of the country in loyalty to its government and institutions. Here, Abraham was clearly a fellow citizen, a patriot among compatriots, joining others in advancing the common welfare. However, there was another aspect, spiritual, in which Abraham regarded himself as a stranger. His identification and solidarity with his fellow citizens in the secular realm did not imply his readiness to relinquish any aspects of his religious uniqueness. His was a different faith, and he was governed by perceptions, truths, and observances which set him apart from the larger faith community. In this regard, Abraham and his descendants would always remain strangers. And this is what Abraham's trying to explain to Bnei Chet. Look, I'm one of you, and it's very nice you call me Nasi Elohim B'tochenu, a prince of God in our midst, and I love you too. And I'm a compatriot of yours. But when it comes to ritual things like burial, we're separate, we're different, because I have my own faith, different to yours. Now, Rav Soloveitchik took this dual identity of Ger v'Toshav. He used it in a number of different contexts. Sometimes it was used to describe what it means to be a Jew in the world, as indeed in the excerpt directly here. Later on in the drasha, he makes it out that this is the role of being Mizrahi, the religious Zionists, among the secular Zionists. Yes, we are part of this national movement that includes religious and secular people, and we're proud to be members alongside you. But, you know, when it comes to your secularism, we don't sign on to that because we hold on to our faith. And if that means that we're always going to be, to some extent, alienated from the rest of the Zionist movement as religious Zionists, then so be it. That won't stop us from viewing ourselves as you know, brothers in arms and united by this very important mission that we share. But so long as you retain your secularism, there always will be a difference, and we always will be both Toshavim, residents, but also Geirim, strangers among you. But what's interesting is that Abraham's initial use of this word, of this duality, isn't about the Jewish experience in the diaspora, which is what Rav Soloveitchik takes it to be. It was uttered first in the land of Israel, in Hebron, right, one of the holy cities. So yeah, it's always struck me as a profound understanding of Abraham's words and a brilliant articulation of the modern Orthodox mindset to unpack this dual identity in the way that Rav Soloveitchik does. We are Jews, we are faithful to the Torah whilst also striving to be citizens of the wider world, that we're always resident aliens. But still, you might think that that's true in exile. A Jew in a foreign land has to be a resident alien. But even though Abraham was saying these words in the land of Israel, you know, you might say, look, he was speaking before the advent of Jewish sovereignty. He wasn't in a Jewish state of Israel. He was still living the life of a Jew in exile, even though geographically he was in the promised land. But what's remarkable is that God himself, I'm sure Rav Soloveitchik was aware of this, God himself utters Abraham's words to the Jews just before they create the first sovereign state in the land of Israel. It's at that point in time, God instructs the Jews that they have no right to sell a freehold over any patch of land in Israel. Instead, they're allowed to sell land for up to 50 years, because every 50th year is a Jubilee year and land goes back to original owners. So at most you can sell a lease, right? A lease of up to 50 years. You can't sell a freehold in the land. Why? God explains in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 25, verse 23. He says, the land must not be sold beyond reclaim. It must not be sold l'tzmitut, which means into perpetuity. Ki li haaretz, for the land is mine, says God. V'geirim v'toshavim atem imadi. You are resident aliens with me. There, God echoes Abraham's words to Bnei Het, but this is no longer before the creation of Jewish sovereignty in the land. This is a description of how it's supposed to be in the sovereign land, right? So it's not that we come home to Israel and we can stop being Geirim v'Toshavim. That is how it always supposed to be, even in the promised land, even in the homeland. So, in other words, don't think that taking possession of a land and creating a sovereign state changes anything here. You were strangers beforehand, and strangers you will remain, which takes us to Franz Rosenzweig. Rosenzweig recognizes what he takes to be a subversive message in the text of the Bible. Because despite the centrality of the land of Israel, Rosenzweig recognizes, and this is a very controversial thing to say in our Zionist community, and I count myself as a Zionist, I made Aliyah, but Rosenzweig recognizes that Torah is actually opposed to the notion of a homeland, a moledet, a homeland. And this message starts with Abraham. Abraham is an immigrant. Now, here's the quote. It's in the handout. This is Rosenzweig describing Abraham. It reads, his story begins, as the Holy Book recounts it, with the divine command to go out of the land of his birth and to go into a land that God will show him. And the people becomes the people in exile. The Egyptian one, as later the one in Babylon. Those are the times that really shape our identity. Moreover, for the eternal people, the homeland never becomes its own. The land is in the deepest sense God's, right? To carry on with the quote from Rosenzweig, it belongs to Israel only as a land of longing, as holy land, And here the distinction that Rosenzweig is drawing is a distinction between homeland and holy land, right? We don't really have a homeland, we have a holy land. And that is why for Israel, even when it is at home, again, differently from all peoples of the earth, this full proprietorship of the homeland is disputed. It is itself, the Jewish people is itself only a stranger and a tenant, a ger v'toshav, in its land. Ki li haaretz, the land is mine, said God to the people. So Judaism starts with the commandment to leave the homeland. Like, we became a people in Egypt, and more formally at the revelation at Sinai in the desert. That's to say, we became a people in exile. The Babylonian Talmud, which is the backbone of our lived religion, was redacted in the Babylonian exile. You know, you could mean two things by the Babylonian exile. You could mean the first exile or the second. I think he meant the second. He means in Bavel when we wrote the Talmud. And wherever the Jew finds herself, according to Rosenzweig, she should always feel estranged, because outside of Israel, she shouldn't feel at home because she's in exile. But even in Israel, she shouldn't feel at home because she doesn't have a homeland. All she has is a holy land. And a holy land can belong to no person, not even to a community, because a holy land belongs to God. And the most that you can hope for is to be a resident alien in God's land. Now, of course, Rosenzweig's anti-Zionism bubbles under the surface of this quote. Rosenzweig wasn't a Zionist, he was anti-Zionist. But I think the point could be adopted even by Zionists, and I think it would be a good thing for it to be, because the point is that even if we do have a right to a sovereign state, and even if we're right to assert that right and to defend it, we shouldn't allow our tenure in the Holy Land to make us feel as if the land is ours. Right? You can concurrently defend a Zionist vision of a Jewish sovereign state in the land without collapsing into a kind of chauvinism that pollutes the piety and the humility that comes with forever seeing yourself as a ger v'toshav, as a resident alien. Moreover, a resident alien is able to look other people in the eye and to recognize that so long as they're willing to live alongside us in peace, there is room in the land for them too. Why? Because the land doesn't belong to any of us, it belongs to God. And the Torah, I think, alongside Rosenzweig, it goes out of its way to replace the notion of a homeland. And that's a notion that's soiled in chauvinism, arrogance, xenophobia, with the notion of a holy land, with that long backdrop painted through Rav Soloveitchik and Avraham and Franz Rosenzweig. Now we can look at our Midrash. And our Midrash starts with the very first pasuk of our Parashah, Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv. Right? Jacob dwelt in the land where his father had sojourned, Eretz Canaan, in the land of Canaan. And one of the things I think the Midrash we're about to look at wants to explain is, you know, why does Jacob disappear from the story? That's what I started asking. Like, he disappears into the background this week. And they read, I think, a lot of their answer to that question into this verse. And this verse, of course, you should be sensitive to, uses both of our verbs. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv. Jacob dwelt, that's from Leishev, in the land of his father's sojourning, migurei, which is from lagur. So, and pointedly, our verse suggests that Yaakov sought to have a relationship with the land that his father didn't have. Vayeshev Yaakov be'eretz migurei aviv. So it's like Yaakov sought to dwell where his father merely sojourned, and that's what takes us to our midrash. Let me open up the handout again on my screen. a Midrash in Bereshit Rabbah. Amar Rav Acha. Rav Acha says, "B'sha'ah she'hatzadikim yoshvim b'shalva umevakshim leishev b'shalva ba'olam hazeh." When the righteous sit back in tranquility and request to dwell leishev b'shalva, in tranquility in this world, it's at that moment that the Satan ba'u-makadreg, the Satan, Satan in the rabbinic imagination, is much more often portrayed not like Milton's fallen angels, but as an angel who works for God. His job is just to be the prosecuting angel. And the Midrash says, when does the prosecuting angel get up and prosecute? He gets up and prosecutes when the righteous seek to dwell in tranquility in this world. Amar, the Satan says, Lo dayan, shehu metukan lahem le'olam haba, ela shehem mevakshim l'shev b'shalva ba'olam hazeh. Is it not enough that the righteous have prepared for them, stored up for them in the world to come, that they also want to dwell in tranquility in this world? What cheek! Rav Acha says, you can know that I'm right about this because of this week's Parashah. Yaakov Avinu, Jacob our father, Al Yidei Shabikesh Leishev B'Shalva Ba'olam Hazeh. Jacob, because he wanted to rest, Leishev, this dwelling in tranquility in this world, Nizdaveg lo Sitno Shel Yosef. He appointed for him, or he kind of arranged for him the trouble with Joseph, what was about to happen with Joseph. The trouble with Joseph being, of course, the brothers' attempt to kill him, sell him into slavery, the deception that he died when he hadn't really died, all of that. Satan arranged for that. Satan arranged for that, says the Midrash, because Yaakov had the temerity to want to live in tranquility. Vayeshev Yaakov. And then it quotes from the book of Job. Lo shalavti v'lo shakatati. I had no tranquility, I had no quiet. Lo shalavti, I had no tranquility. That's me Esav. V'lo shakatati, that's from Lavan. V'lo nachti, this is a continuation of the verse from Job. I had no rest. Medina, that's from the rape and subsequent fallout of the rape of Dinah. But Yavo Roges, the end of the verse from Job says, and I was come upon by a how does it translate it in the, by trouble. Trouble came upon me. Shel Yosef, the trouble of Joseph came upon me. Let me open up my notes. Oh no, I didn't mean to do it that way. I don't have these troubles while I'm teaching a class in actual person. Okay, so I want to tie together a lot of the things we've spoken about up until now. I think what's happening is the explanation of Yaakov's disappearing is that Yaakov wanted to retire, right? Yaakov sought to settle down in the land of his father's sojournings. Yaakov sought to feel at home in the land of his father's estrangement. Now, the Midrash rebukes him for this, as if it's audacious, right? And this is why trouble doubles down upon him as he fades into the background of this week's reading. Now, you could read this Midrash in the light of Rosenzweig. Perhaps Yaakov sought to feel at home in the Holy Land. He started to feel a sense of entitlement. But I don't think that gels at all with Yaakov's character, which we've been painting from the very beginning of his, of his career in the Bible. By nature, as we've explored over the last few weeks, Yaakov is unassuming, he's timid, he's pure-hearted, he's introverted. So I think what's much more likely here is it's not the threat of chauvinism, it's just that Yaakov wants to retire. Yaakov was always reluctant to engage with the world around him. He was always reluctant, as we've seen, to dirty his hands. He didn't want to lie to his father. His mum had to push him to do it. Now, of course, in doing it, he revealed a deep truth to himself and to his father, and it was important that he did it. But then he sees this ladder in front of him, which represents leadership and power and statecraft and politics. And he doesn't want to get his hands dirty on that. Eventually, he learns somehow, perhaps through the example or the negative example of Lavan, he learns some harsh realities about what it means to live in this world. And he comes back to Israel, and he has this mighty confrontation with Esau, where he proves himself. He proves that he's able to act in this world without fear of getting his hands dirty, and to live with the consequences, the negative consequences of good action. As I said at the end of the last class I gave, the midrash I'm focusing on here is when the Bible describes Yaakov as afraid and distressed, afraid that he might be killed, but distressed that he might have to kill, because even though he knows it will be the right thing and he's prepared to do it, he's sensitive to the negative stain that can attach to one's hands, even in the prosecution of good deeds. After all of that, he thought he'd earned the right to, so to speak, retire from the world. He's done it, right? We've had his story. He's got to the apex and he proved himself. So he wanted to return to the tent-dwelling, studious lifestyle of his youth, to return to the life he lived before his mother ever encouraged him to deceive his father, to return to the peace and the quiet that surrounded him in the purity of his youth. That perhaps is why Yaakov recedes into the background as the stories of Yosef and Yehuda unfold. And perhaps, he also retires to some extent into his own grief, because his beloved Rachel has died at the same, pretty much, not long before his eldest son and the first fruit of his love with his deceased wife, he disappears. Having said that, our midrash is unhappy with Yaakov, right? Just as we should never feel that we own the land upon which we walk, we should also perhaps never feel at home in a world that's broken and in need of repair. There's plenty of peace and quiet stored up for the righteous in the perfect existence of the world to come. That's what Satan says, right? But Satan's not a bad guy in this midrash, right? Satan's just doing his job. But in the meantime, we do live in a broken world, and we are summoned to play our part in fixing it. And the problem with feeling at home is that we start to feel inured to evil, pain, and suffering in our midst. Right? To feel at home in a broken world is to feel reconciled to its brokenness or to ignore it. And that, right, not just because of a dislike of the chauvinism of nationalism, though that may be part of it, that's why we're summoned to view ourselves always as strangers, right? I often make this point when I share this midrash with people that there's nothing wrong in having, beautiful homes. There's nothing wrong with having a degree of physical comfort. There's nothing wrong. This is why I don't think this message is incompatible with Zionism, because ultimately I don't think there's anything wrong with asserting our right to live in security in the land of our ancestors. And we're not wrong to want these things. But the challenge that we learn from Abraham's notion of a ger v'toshav, which is a notion that Hashem himself endorses in Sefer Vayikra, is that we should never allow the beauty of our homes to leave us feeling at home in a broken world. We shouldn't allow our physical comfort to leave us feeling comfortable with or reconciled to the pain of others. We shouldn't allow the notion of a holy land to be sullied by a chauvinistic patriotism for a homeland. I think it's worth noting that of our two biblical verbs for living in a place, I mentioned in passing at the beginning, lashevet and lagur, that modern Hebrew only has this verb, or mainly has this verb lagur, to sojourn. So I'm proud to say to hundreds of generations of exiles prayed to return, that I do live in the land of Israel. But if I wanted to say that in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, I'd say Ani gar be'eretz Yisrael, which you could translate to, I am a stranger in the land of Israel. And that, I think, is how it should be, since that's what we're called upon to be strangers, always. Geirim v'toshavim, but geirim v'toshavim. Right? And I think I mentioned this in response to something Jennifer said in an earlier class. Consider also the fact that a convert to Judaism, even after conversion, is called a ger. That means a stranger. The process of conversion is called giur, right? Which means like becoming a stranger, lehitgayer, to make oneself a stranger. Well, I mean, you could think, and I suppose there's some grounds for this, you could think that what that means is when you become a convert, you are always going to be somewhat estranged from the Jewish people because you weren't born Jewish. And when the Torah tells us to love the stranger and the stranger in our midst, the rabbis are very keen to apply those teachings. I don't think, it's important to note, the rabbis say this themselves. Even when a halachic midrash takes a word and extends it beyond its normal range of meaning, the pshat, the original meaning, doesn't disappear. So the original meaning of love the stranger is any stranger. Doesn't matter if they've converted to Judaism or not. But the halachic midrash is that we're talking specifically about converts here. Love the convert. But why is the convert a stranger? Well, like I said, it could be, and I think this is probably part of the pshat of the halachic midrash, part of the simple meaning of the halachic midrash, is that there's a sense in which a convert will always feel perhaps estranged because they weren't born Jewish. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think that to become a convert is to leave your birth family and your birth nation and your moledet, your homeland, behind. It's actually to answer the call that Abraham was called upon to do. Leave your land, your homeland, your family, leave it all behind. And that's what the ger does. So they become a stranger from the situations of their birth. And in fact, so much is that the case in Jewish law, it goes to quite some extremes. If a brother and a sister, biological brother and sister, both convert to Judaism, then from biblical law, they're not considered brother and sister. They could marry one another. The rabbis don't allow it because, it's prudential perhaps not to allow brothers and sisters to marry one another. Also, kind of almost comically, the rabbis say, you don't want to make conversion look like a loophole that allows incest or something like that. That would be a bad look for conversion. So we don't allow it. But from the point of view of the Bible, they're not brother and sister anymore, a biblical law. And this has some practical ramifications. For example, two brothers are not allowed to testify in the same court case, either for the same side or for opposite sides. That family connection is seen somehow to pollute objectivity, and it's not allowed. Even if both brothers are, if it's Moshe and Aharon, they could be the most righteous of brothers. No, it perverts their objectivity, however much they may try. But if they are biological brothers who converted to Judaism, they are allowed to testify in the same court cases, because Jewish law views them as a new being, right? They come out of the mikveh as if they've been born again. You talk about born again Christianity, right? A convert that comes out of the mikveh is a new being. Now, that I think is why a convert more deep down is called a ger, because they've taken their entire life up until now and estranged themselves from it. Like Abraham is called an Ivri, according to the Midrash, Ish Ivri, a Hebrew, because everybody stood on one side of the Euphrates and he stood on the other side, Me'ever, on the other side of the river. He was an iconoclast, and he estranged himself from the culture, the people, the situation of his birth. That's what it is to be a Jew. So, of course, to convert is to become a stranger, because to be a stranger is to be a Jew. We should all be Gerim, right? What better proof could there be that to be a Jew is to be called upon always to be a stranger, than the notion that to become a Jew is to be mitgayer? It's literally become a stranger. So a religious personality, I think this takes us back to Noach as well, right? To one of the readings in Parashat Noach we looked at in the Zohar, that looks at the ark, Noah's Ark, as a refuge from the tumult of day-to-day life. A religious person might yearn for the silence of the monastery or the mountaintop or the yeshiva, right? Yaakov is an ish. What is it? Yoshev Oalim. He's a tent dweller. He likes to be inside. But we're called upon never to settle for the quiet life until the broken world is healed. So all of that, I think, is written into this midrash. Now we have 20 minutes left, and I want to do something with you. I want to skip the story of Yosef and the brothers and all of that that's coming in the next few weeks, because I'm not going to be here with you to experience it together. But we've gone so far in Yaakov's life that it might be interesting to look at the very end of Yaakov's life and see how this story of I've been trying to frame things to some extent as Yaakov as a person who symbolizes truth and a kind of spiritual purity, but living in a world of these horrible entanglements. No wonder he wants to retire as soon as he thinks he's proved his point. But you're not supposed to. We leave him. We part company from him in Parashat Vayechi when he dies, the last Parashah of Sefer Bereshit. And since I won't be with you for that, I thought maybe I'll share with you just one midrashic insight from that Parashah in the time that we have left. And something else I'll do. I have written an article called, let me remind myself what it's called, Give Truth to Jacob, from that verse in Micah, give truth to Jacob and loving kindness to Abraham. I was asked to write it, but for a book that's coming out with Cambridge University Press by Judith Wolfe and Eleanor Stump. And I'll share a draft with you here because it kind of summarizes the life of Jacob as I see it through the eyes of the Midrash. It's almost like a partial biography, spiritual biography of Jacob. So let me put that in the chat for those who are interested. Please don't circulate it widely because it will be published eventually, and this isn't the sort of the final pagination, whatever. Okay, that's there for you. Look, what I want to say just quickly about Parashat Vayechi is that Yaakov gathers all of his sons right at the end of the story. Once that peace has been made and they're being reunited and they're in Egypt, he gathers all his sons together around his deathbed. And he says why he's doing this. This is chapter 49, verse 1. He says, I'm gathering you together because I want to tell you what will befall you in the end of days. So he's promising this like amazing revelation. But nothing like that happens. If you read the Parashah, it's a complete anticlimax. By Jacob's sons, they gather around him, he blesses them, he dies, he's buried, his children continue to live their lives in relative harmony in the land of Egypt. But we were promised a revelation about what would occur in the end of days. You don't get it, okay? And there are various ways you could try to respond to this. One route is to suggest that Yaakov did reveal the end of days to his children in kind of codes and riddles hidden in the blessings. And that's one kind of hermeneutical route for unraveling what the blessings really mean. And that route would encourage you to kind of pore over the words of his blessings and try and find. But no, there's another response entirely, and it's a response in the Midrash. Those of you interested, it's Midrash Tanchuma, Parashat Vayechi, Chet, right? Chapter 8 of the Midrash is the Tanchuma on Parashat Vayechi. I'll just read you an English summary of the Midrash because we don't have that long. It says, what can this be compared to? To a slave in whom the king entrusted all that was in his hand. When the slave was about to die, he called his children in order to set them free and to tell them where their freedom proclamation was hidden. The king knew about this, i.e., the king found out about the servant's plan to free his children behind the king's back. He therefore came into the room and stood above the slave. When the slave saw the king, he abandoned his plan to reveal to his children where their documents could be found. Instead, the slave began to speak to his children, saying, "Oh, if you please, you are the slaves of a king. You should honor him just as I honored him all my life." Says the Midrash. So too Jacob gathered his children to reveal to them the end of days. The Holy One, blessed be he, appeared above Yaakov. And when Yaakov saw God, he abandoned his plan to reveal the end of days, and instead he just gave them brachot. Okay. This text is just one of my favorite midrashim, right? We've said that Yaakov is a personification of truth. In this midrash, Yaakov has a truth that he wants to reveal to his children. Of course he does, because he is the symbol of truth, right? Yaakov believes, so to speak, that this truth will set his children free. But free from what? Free from God? Is God really to be compared to a slave master from whom we'd love to break free if only we could find the hidden paperwork, right? And was Yaakov's praise of God and his blessings just the insincere words of the dying slave in the parable? Right? I think that according to our Midrash, Hashem has one final lesson to teach Yaakov at the end of his life, and it's a lesson about the limitations of truth. Right? There's a basic intuition that truth is always good and falsehood always bad. And there's a related intuition that knowledge is always good and ignorance is always bad. So if Yaakov knew some truth or other, he would naturally want to share that knowledge. So Yaakov's seen a vision of the end of days, and knowledge is good and good things should be shared. And so Yaakov, the man of truth, wants to tell his children what he knew. He wanted to tell them what would befall them in the end of days, right? And ignorance is a vice. And indeed, a person can often be criticized for their ignorance. Like if they passed judgment or acted on insufficient evidence, we quite naturally blame them for not doing more to dispel their ignorance. But there may be times, right? If you're interested, Rudolf Carnap is heavily associated, so is John Locke, with this idea that knowledge is always good, truth is always good, evidence is always good. But Carnap was wrong, because it isn't always rational to gather all of the available evidence. Sometimes it's actually quite reasonable not to want to know something, even if that something would be relevant to your rational deliberations. There's an Israeli philosopher, sadly died long before her time, Edna Ullman Margalit, the wife of a well-known philosopher called Avishai Margalit. Anyway, she writes, a defense attorney in a murder case may decide to avoid asking her client the direct question of whether or not he committed the crime. She will instead only ask him whether he wishes to plead guilty or not guilty. The attorney in such a case may say to herself, I don't want to know the answer to the question whether my client is guilty or innocent. She assesses, it's just a quote from Edna Ullman Margalit, she assesses that she will do a better and more professional job if she doesn't know whether or not she's defending an innocent person. Here's another example of my own creation. Imagine there's an oracle who can see clearly into the future. And imagine that she can give you right now a completely accurate list of all of the future decisions that you're going to make and when you're going to make them. Like, would you want her to produce such a list? And would you want to look at it? On the one hand, the information contained in this list would be directly relevant to you in your life. On the other hand, if you read it, and if the list was really 100% accurate and completely certain, then from then onward, you'd never feel in control of your own decisions. Your decisions will always seem to you to have been made already. Your sense of freedom would be lost, right? A similar question, I suppose, would be like, would you want to know on exactly what day you are destined to die? You might want to know the general region, how many, decades you've got left, how many years, but I guess to days, months, hours, that sort of knowledge could perhaps be crippling. Okay. So knowledge, yes, in general is a good thing, right? Carnap has this thing he calls the requirement of total evidence. You should always have as much evidence as you possibly can before you broach any kind of question. But we've discovered that even if there's a kernel of truth to that, it has a lot of exceptions. Yaakov, on the midrashic personification of him, he thought that all knowledge would be good. It always sets us free. And perhaps Yaakov was bound to think that because Yaakov, after all, represents truth. But in the final lesson of his life, God taught Yaakov that the secrets that God keeps from humanity, they're not like a hidden writ of emancipation that would only set us free if only we knew them. The knowledge that God hides from us wouldn't set us free, right? God, he can't make room for our very existence, let alone our freedom, unless to some extent God has to hide from us. It's called tzimtzum. The midrash that I'm quoting, this midrash Tanchuma on Parashat Vayechi, it ends with a quote, and it's painted as if God is quoting this line to Yaakov. It's a quote from the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs says, the hidden thing is the glory of God, and the glory of kings is the thing that is looked for. As the Midrash wants to read the proverb, God is telling Yaakov, yes, there is knowledge that we should be eager to search out. To do so is the glory of kings, right? The glory of kings is the thing that is looked for. That's wonderful. And if I were your king and you were my slave, then you'd be doing the right thing to pass that knowledge on, to reveal the hidden and to free your children. But I'm not merely a king, I am God. And the glory of God is not made manifest merely by things that we come to know. Instead, the glory of God is made manifest by the fact that to know too much about him would destroy us. God's rebuke goes further. The Midrash continues. This is the word of God to Yaakov. He says, apparently you, Yaakov, do not possess this attribute. And then he quotes him one more quote from Proverbs. The talebearer goes about revealing secrets, but the person of a faithful spirit covers it up. What is the attribute that Jacob doesn't have? God's distance is painful to a person of truth who's seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. But God's distance is part of his glory, because his distance is what creates room for our freedom. And coming to terms with the hiddenness of God is what Jacob is struggling with here. Right? Jacob had never wanted to hide, even as his mother cajoled him into hiding behind a disguise. But God always has to hide. Right? That's this notion that comes out in the Kabbalah much later of tzimtzum. Right? God hides in order to give us space to be. And we're not supposed to know the end of days. We are instead supposed to bring them. through the wise and righteous use of our freedom. So there's this nice arc in the life of Jacob. You could begin by looking at Jacob's life and saying, how strange that of all the divine attributes that the sages decide to attribute to Jacob, it's truth. He lies his way into the position of the firstborn. He's a wheeler dealer in the house of Lavan, and no, there's a consistent story to be told about this poor young man whose entire kind of character is towards ideological purity, truth, sincerity, but he's thrust into a world of darkness. And the entire story of Jacob's life is the lessons that such a person has to live in the course of being in this imperfect world. You have to be willing to get your hands dirty. You're never allowed to retire, is what we learn from Parashat Vayeshev, right? That all of these terrible things that happen to him is because he chooses to retire. You can't retire. You can retire from a job. You can't retire from the service of God. And finally, in Parashat Vayechi, right, all we know from the story is he gathers his children to tell them one last great truth, and he never gets to. The rabbis turn that into Jacob's final lesson, which is that actually not every truth needs to be shared. Not every item of knowledge would be good for people to know, at least not here, at least not now. Anyway, there you go. That's the life of Jacob.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Can
So
I
you
ask
have,
you a question? Oh.
yeah, please. Yeah, have a few minutes. I just wanted to mention, so you have this essay, if
Please.
you'd like to read it. And if people have further questions, they can be in contact with me. My website is samlebens.com, and people can contact me through that website if they have further questions. Yes, Jennifer, please, in the minutes remaining.
Yeah, I know we have to sign off very soon. The question of knowledge versus actually believing it. And I wondered if there's any interplay we see that in everyday life, that know something is true, but whether people believe it or not, they believe what they believe. I wondered if there's any interplay in the Torah between what people know, a conflict between what they know and what they believe. I haven't. You have far vast.
Well, that's a very interesting question. In this, it depends. Of course, philosophers always like to define terms. So it depends on what we mean by know, and depends on what we mean by believe.
Yeah.
But in the Midrash that I shared with you from the Tanchuma on Parashat Vayechi, it's almost as if, look, it's better for people to believe in an end of days without necessarily knowing too much about its contours, right? So that's a time in which perhaps belief would be better than knowledge. Like mere belief would be better than knowledge. In a lot of my work, philosophical work, I've spent time trying to distinguish faith and belief. That you can have faith. You can have faith that something is true. Can you have faith that something is true without believing that it's true? Can you? And I think there is sometimes a conflict in Tanakh between what a person has faith in and what a person knows, because I think that those gaps are the gaps of doubt. I think Jonah is a very good story for thinking about these things. I mean, because it's a very peculiar idea that he thinks he can run away from the prophecy of God.
He believes it, yeah.
Yeah, I think there must be some sort of cognitive dissonance, because like, is it really a surprise to him that God can kind of reach in at sea? So
right,
that might be a good story to explore for thinking about a gap between what a person knows, what a person feels, what a person thinks, what a person believes. I'm sure there are others. That's the first that comes to mind. But this is an interesting, almost mirror image, where perhaps knowledge would be damaging, and belief and faith is better than knowledge. But I don't think that's the norm. but it's interesting that there are cases like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's fascinating to think
Yeah.
that faith, belief, knowledge.
And knowledge, yeah,
Yeah.
and the interplay between them, right? And sometimes they help each other out. So it's easier to have faith in things that you already believe, and certainly if you know it, you have even more confidence. There are times when they seem to be in conflict. You know, that to know a thing would somehow undermine the sense in which we could say you truly have faith. Yeah. Anyway, on that
Thank you so much.
interesting network of notions, I'll hand back to Drisha. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Yael. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much to everyone who joined us, and thank you, Rabbi Dr. Lebens.
Thank you.
Okay. This has been a really lovely and fascinating series that I know I have really enjoyed, and we have had many people here and on Facebook, and I've all really enjoyed and benefited from it. So thank you so much, and look forward to learning with you again soon. I want to give a quick plug. This evening we have the Bohm Memorial Lecture with Rabbi Dr. Ariel Evan Mays, and he's going to be lecturing on a topic related to Judaism and the environment. So that's very exciting.
He is great.
Yeah. So I'm going to put the link for that in the chat. It's bohm.drisha.org. And yeah, we're very excited for that. So please join us. And as well, we have coming up our virtual Winter's Month on the topic of kavana, or intention. So please check that out as well. And we're looking forward to learning with you more in the new year. Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.